Ciao, everyone. Welcome to Spazio, a monthly series that highlights Italy's enduring role in the space ecosystem. I am your host, Kelly Kiedis Ogborn, and to our viewers all over the world, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Today is episode 5, where we will discuss how collaboration in the private sector is really driving the future of space infrastructure and really changing the paradigm and how we will engage and do business in space. I am joined by representatives of two companies at the forefront, Argotec and Axiom Space, to dive into their work and how they envision the future unfolding. Before we get into the discussion, please allow me a brief introduction of both. Joining me today is Mr. David Avino, who is the founder and CEO of Argotec. Mr. Avino began his career in aerospace in 1998 following his service in the Italian Special Forces. Throughout his 25-year career, some notable highlights include serving as the operations manager of the first European long-duration mission on the International Space Station, as well as becoming a certified NASA and ESA instructor in 2005. He founded his current company, Argotec, in 2008, which has exponentially grown since then. In 2013, he developed the first European commercial activity in the space sector, involving Lavazza in a partnership with the Italian Space Agency. In 2016, they received the NASA Award for the best experiment carried out on the International Space Station. In 2018, Forbes Italy mentioned them among the 5 most influential aerospace companies in the country. Last year, in 2022, they successfully completed 2 historic missions with NASA related to the DART mission and Artemis 1, and they were the only company in the world with 2 microsatellites operating in deep space. And then this year, they announced their new space park, so trajectory has just been going up. In his spare time, he sits on several boards and is the president of the Italian Association for Cancer Research of Piedmont and Valle d'Aosta. So, David, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much to you, to Space Foundation, and also the Italian Trade Agency for inviting me.
We're so happy to have you. And then your counterpart today is Kirsten Whittingham, who is the Director of Revenue of Operations at Axiom Space, where she maintains responsibility for effective and efficient revenue generation, including supporting international government and corporate contractual relationships for the Houston-based company. Ms. Whittingham has nearly 20 years of experience in the aerospace sector, spanning both the U.S. government and commercial. During her early career, she supported real-time shuttle and space station operations within NASA's Mission Control Center. She then led complex multi-million-dollar programs and has experience with managing programs across development, production, and sustainment phases. She later was the director of F-100 Logistics Program Management for Pratt & Whitney Military Engines, where she led an organization of program managers supporting 23 domestic and international military customers. She had ultimate responsibility for contract compliance, maintenance forecasting, technical issue resolutions, flight of safety, and overall customer satisfaction. It's quite a big job, and we are very, very happy to have you today.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So I am really excited to dive into this conversation because as we talk about the space ecosystem and growth within space, private is really a critical component to both establishing, infrastructure capabilities that we're going to be able to grow and scale from. And both of your companies are really enabling and opening up opportunities both for existing and new businesses, as well as new capabilities to be able to flourish and orbit. And so before we get into some of the meat, you can always tell your story better than I can. So I'd love you both just to tell a little bit about Argotec, a little bit about Axiom, and then we'll dive into the discussion. So David, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. Argotec. So first of all, the company was created in 2008. You already told everybody that actually had several years of experience outside the Italian borders, working for the European Space Agency, working at the European Astronaut Center, working on missions for NASA, and also with the Russians. We had the first ever European Russian mission, European and Russian mission. Have been also supporting that kind of missions. And finally, when I came back to Italy, I said, let me start from scratch a company. And actually, we had 2 main pillars, and we still have 2 main pillars. The first pillar is the human space flight. So we are developing from scratch all the systems, subsystems that will help also in the future what we used to call the explorers. The explorers are definitely, not only astronauts, but there will be workers, there will be tourists as well. And just an example for those kind of experiments or technology demonstrators or systems, in 2015 we developed from scratch the famous, I can say, the IS Espresso. That was the coffee maker. As Italians, we wanted to bring something on the International Space Station, and definitely was a good start. Was I guess it was pretty tough experience because when you combine pressure with temperature, it's like creating in microgravity a bomb. And of course, we had a lot of safety issues when we presented the project to NASA. And Kirsten knows very well because most likely she was sitting on the other side on the NASA Mission Control Center at that time. And but that was a really successful project, and this is one of our pillars. So we want to bring, and we already brought several times on the International Space Station, some comfort for the astronauts, from the food to the coffee. We had the different experiments with Barilla, with performance enlightening for the lights on the modules, and other experiments. Actually, we ran more than 20 experiments on the station from scratch, built in our premises, but at the same time controlling from our control center. Actually, today I'm sitting in a control center, one of our two control centers. This is for the satellite missions. And the second pillar for our company is, building what we used to call all in-house concepts. So we do everything from a piece of paper, a white piece of paper, up to the final satellites deployed and delivered and operated in not only in LEO but also far away from Earth. Just an example, we had last year two very important missions. One was LiCHA-Cube, actually, and LiCHA-Cube was included within the famous asteroid mission, the planetary defense, the first ever planetary defense mission. And that one, we deployed the satellite that was deployed just 1 year ago. Actually, it was in September the 12th last year, and was deployed at 14 millions of kilometers above our head, above our Earth. So this was an amazing, incredible mission, and this is the second pillar. So the first pillar, human space flight, well-being, and system and subsystem for supporting the comfort of the explorers. And the second, small satellites up to 80 kilograms, starting from 14 kilograms up to 80 kilograms for Earth observation, telecommunication, and science missions, far away from Earth as well, or in LEO, or in deep space.
Those pillars very much dovetail as well, because it's making sure that once the technology infrastructure is able to scale and be interacted with, then the people have what they need to actually interact, because it's that human technology symbiosis which is really critical for growth and scalability. So we're on both ends of the value chain.
Yeah, that's very much important. And at the same time, those two pillars are connected together, because if you're able to have you want to have the comfort for the astronauts or for the explorers in general. These people, they need to communicate. These people, they need to see. And so that's why, the two pillars, in a certain way, they're working together. They're very complementary for the future of the exploration.
Absolutely. And Kirsten, what about you? I know you guys have a big announcement today. So can you tell us a little bit about Axiom? I think some of our viewers probably know about the company, but maybe just at the high level they do.
And sure, and before I get started, I just want to emphasize how important that coffee is on the International Space Station. So you were doing the Lord's work to get that there. That was one of the comments when we would get supply vehicles when I worked on console. They could smell the like coffee and the fresh fruit when you open up those cargo vehicles. It's important to them, as you were saying before, David. It's something that you're human. You need those fresh comforts. You need to be able to sort of experience life, even though you're on orbit. But let's talk a little bit about Axiom now, and maybe where we've got some of those same or some synergies. So Axiom Space was founded in 2016 with the goal of building the world's first commercial space station. So it's, for me, as somebody who grew up wanting to be an astronaut and later went on to work in mission control, it's really exciting to be among the pioneers of the next stage of human exploration and discovery. So let's talk about the ways that we are doing that. So we like to say that we are building for beyond. That's beyond the ISS, beyond LEO, and I'll define that real quick, low Earth orbit, and beyond what we think we know today. So looking at the International Space Station, which has been in operation now for quite some time and is within about the next decade, it's going to be ending its usable lifetime. So Axiom Space bid on and won a full and open competition in 2020 to connect our station modules to the International Space Station. So after it retires, we'll be able to continue on with the good work that's been going on the International Space Station and be able to expand it. And as you were mentioning a little bit earlier, as we prepare for Axiom Station, we are flying a series of precursor missions to the ISS that allows us to interface with NASA and sort of try out some of our operational concepts, make sure that we have all the kinks worked out before our station. And we're just announcing our crew today for the AX3 mission, which does include a pilot who is from Italy, Colonel Walter Villadei. So we're very excited about that, being able to talk about that finally, because of course he's been with Axiom and training with us for quite some time. So that mission will fly in early 2024, and then we have a fourth mission that we plan for in late 2024. We are currently the only company selected by NASA for these private astronaut missions to the ISS. So that's been an exciting period for us as we gear up to Axiom Station. And then looking at going beyond LEO, we have also been awarded 2 NASA task orders to build spacesuits. So the first task order develops the lunar spacesuits for NASA's return to the moon. And the second task order modifies that same lunar suit and allows us to advance NASA's ISS spacewalk capabilities that they currently have today. We will use that same suit to support our commercial EVAs at Axiom Station. So that's exciting for us in multiple ways. And then looking at going beyond what we think we know today, our vision for the future of space infrastructure in LEO sees our station at the center of this developing ecosystem where both private and public enterprise are thriving together. And LEO is becoming this hub of economic and scientific activity. And so coming back full circle, we get to be the pioneers of sort of figuring this out and leading the way with our space station.
Yeah, it's certainly an exciting time. And when the concept of commercial space stations, I think, capture collective curiosity of people, because people know about the International Space Station, but they think of it as being purely government. And this really opens up a very different dynamic. And what I love about both of your companies is you do different things, but they really are on 3 collaborative themes. So it's infrastructure, right? So creating infrastructure. And then it's creating conditions for people to exploit space, whether for exploration or for business use cases. And then it's really the human side of sustainment, because David, to your point, and Kirsten as well, just talking about coffee and spacesuits and other things. I was actually having a conversation with someone last night, and we were talking about the fact that I wholeheartedly believe that technologically we will achieve what we need to achieve to go to the moon and go to Mars, but humans are going to human. Like the growth and sustainability is fundamentally human centric. And so being able to keep them sane, keep them healthy, keep them happy is really the critical component to being able to enable business opportunities, but also exploration.
Right. And just jumping in on that thought process, that really hasn't been the focus of NASA and ESA. I mean, there's a bit of, we got to make sure that they're safe and they're protected and there's psychological support, but they're not really focused on developing these cultural things that we hold so dear. So the coffee being a great example. You might read articles about alcohol on station. That's not something that the regen systems have traditionally been designed for. But when you start talking about humans being in space, it really changes everything. It's not a government program anymore. And we're trying to look at how you can have your civilization sort of transferred and you have all your cultural norms, all your habits.
That is really going to be the linchpin and the critical component. And diving a bit further into the Italy connection. So it is obviously not by accident that the two of you are on this episode. And Kirsten, I know you mentioned your new Italian pilot for the crew, but there was also a pretty large announcement of an MOU that was signed between Axiom and Italy. And so I'd love to ask you both about your perspectives on it. So Kirsten, for you first, I'd love to know what it is and why it's important. And then David, from your perspective, what this means for Italian companies.
Sure. So, just a little bit of background. We signed the MOU in May of 2022. So, we've had it for just a little over a year. It has three main elements of cooperation in the MOU outlined as collaboration on user requirements for commercial business activities in orbit. And I like to think of that as a bit iterative. So industry will say these are the things we want to do. And then, Axiom Station comes back with what we're able to provide. And then you sort of advance and iterate from there. So there's a little bit of learning from the industry. And the industry also learns from the people who have a bit of expertise in developing facilities and experiments on board microgravity environments. Then the second area is defining a business model for a possible Italian module on Axiom Station. So we have our base design of what Axiom Station will be, but we would love to be able to expand that and have other governments such as Italy possibly have ownership of a module and seeing if that makes sense for them. And then third is development of research projects that contribute to space exploration. And that's everything from medicine to robotics and everything in between. We will be seeing some of these Italian projects on an upcoming Axiom mission. So it's really exciting for us both. So that shows how our MOU is. It's not just a piece of paper. There's active work going on. There's lots of discussion with Italian industry and advancing these projects and making them something that is fruitful for both Axiom Station and for the Italians.
You really have no better partner designing a habitable module for the space station than Italy with their heritage and expertise with the ISS.
Exactly.
And David, from your perspective, this is very exciting news, obviously, and it's continuing to propel and connect Italy both for civil projects but also commercial. And from a company stance, how has that impacted Italian companies wanting to engage with space, engage with Axiom? I'm curious your perspective.
I can say that definitely this is going to be a very important opportunity for the future. As we already started in 2013 signing the first agreement between Argotec, the Italian Space Agency, as well, that was supporting to have some experiments on old technology demonstrators on the International Space Station, and companies coming outside the space business. I just put in an example like Lavazza, but actually we had several other examples. And in 2017, taking advantage, of course, of the experience we had with Lavazza, we put in place a new project that was called Open Space. It's a trademark of Argotec. Open Space means bringing companies from outside the space business into the space business. And we put in place a really nice way of engaging these people, having round tables, taking their requirements, explaining a little bit, because some of those companies, they don't know why they need to go in space, and also the requirements to go in space. So that's why Argotec is just in the middle between those companies and the possibility of these companies flying. And we put in place already several times with different companies, and this is going to be an asset for the future, maybe also collaborating together with Axiom, because it is very, very much important to let these people, these companies, knowing that the space is going to be an incredible opportunity on two sides. The first side is that it's a new business, and definitely maybe they can get advantage of the business in space. And at the same time, some of the technologies, just an example for Lavazza, we developed this technology. We had two different patents, and we're reusing those patents on Earth applications. So why two opportunities? One is that having a new business in space is going to be very important for these companies, and at the same time, having this kind of technologies and bring it here on Earth, they can take advantage and in a certain way reusing this technology and increasing some of these projects or these systems here on Earth or application here on Earth. So we are, getting in touch with a lot of different companies in Europe, and this is going to be very important. On the other side, having, a commercial space station is going to be a game changer, because I've been working, when I was at ESA with several research entities, And of course, we had a lot of gaps between when the professors, so the research entities, were thinking about an experiment to be run on the space station and when really this experiment run on the station. Of course, having a commercial entity, this gap is going to reduce a lot, and so means that most of the time the ideas, the research opportunities, they're going to be reality just in a few months, and this is going to be very, very important.
You hit on such a critical aspect that is really core to a lot of what we do at Space Commerce Institute and talk about all the time. And it's really the being able to learn things in space, do things in space that benefit life on Earth. And I think that theme is really pervasive in getting kind of the totality of societies and cultures to understand why space is important. And it is partially exploration, but we get better practices, procedures, technologies, opportunities down on Earth because of it. Because right now, the bulk of I don't want to say opportunity, the bulk of return on investment, right, and economic development is really the space to Earth market. And so it's everything that we have here that we have space to thank. And I'd be curious from your perspectives when you look at those opportunities in low Earth orbit. Because Axiom, the space station is certainly going to allow companies and individuals to exploit conditions in space for use on Earth and for other industries. And so, from both of your perspectives, what is currently being built that may need more focus, right? So, areas that people need to realize is accessible. And then, what opportunities exist for space companies and research institutions to be involved in?
So when I think of what focus we need for infrastructure, the first thing I kind of go to is it would be interesting to see more launch providers. Even NASA is reliant on a single launch provider for crew transportation right now. And so it would just be interesting to see competition in this area to drive down costs. And I mean that even like from a cargo perspective, even though there's a couple of other providers. When you look across the broad industry, there are more providers, but it's still, it is still sort of a small market. And I think that's something that would be interesting to see grow, drive down those costs and provide more opportunity for all. I think when we're looking at developing things in orbit, and you were kind of touching on this with one of your comments, it's the space-based services, because you were talking about like right now we're focused on the things that we bring back down to Earth. But as we grow, it'll be interesting to see things like computing services and manufacturing services meant for in space, or logistics services like satellite refueling, because those are the services that I think have the most potential to have a higher return on investment in the long run, that eliminates that need for any launch and return services. And then it helps you grow out from that LEO economy and really drive that further out in the universe.
No, you're absolutely right. In order to truly unlock business opportunity, you have to take Earth out of the equation. And it starts with space to Earth, but ultimately we have to be able to build an infrastructure in space for space. And I agree with you. That's really the next evolution that we're building toward. But it takes a stepping stone approach.
100%.
Yeah, on my side, actually, have two words. The first word is sustainability, and the second is capability of processing on board. I'm thinking about satellites on board, some images or other data. And for the sustainability, I can say this is going to be very, very, very much important. The main issue is that, of course, there are some countries that whenever all the main countries that will put some rules, other countries maybe they're not going to follow those rules, and this is going to be a disadvantage from an economic point of view. But we need to go towards a sustainability for the future, because just an example, a few years ago, the reboost of the station was almost just when there was a draft of the station. Now the reboost of the station is happening a lot of times just for debris avoidance maneuvers. And even more because we are sending in space whatever we think to be sent, because of course thanks to the launchers now the prices and the cost of launch is almost peanuts, and everybody's going to launch something without having too many rules to be applied on their hardware. And this is going to be not sustainable for LEO in the future. This is going to create a lot of issues, so to the space station, so to other satellites, and maybe having a crash between satellites or different objects and creating more debris. this is something that we need to start as soon as possible to avoid, because otherwise the space, at least in LEO, it will become almost impossible to be usable. And just an example, in our company, we have as a keyword the sustainability, because when we started from scratch our new bus, the satellite platform, we said we don't want to be cheap, we want to be reliable. If you're reliable, means that most of the time you're not cheap, but actually you are at the same time you're going to be sustainable. Because if we put a rule that at least our satellites had to have a lifetime of 5 years, and using all radar components, all high reliability components, etc. This is something that is going to be very much appreciated in the future by our customers, and at the same time by the final clients. Because if you're providing data to all Earth observation images or whatever to the final customers, they don't care if you're using $100K of satellites or 100 millions of satellites. They wanted to have the data right away in that specific moment. So if you combine reliability with sustainability, actually you're going to be it's very important for the future. And the second word, the keyword, was the processing, because we have and terabytes of data being downloaded every time from satellites in LEO. What we're trying to do, actually, we're going to do with a new constellation of satellites we are going to deploy in 1 year and a half, in 2 years roughly, for the Italian government, of 40 satellites in LEO for the Earth observation. What we put on board actually was taking advantage, of course, of the experience we had in the LICHA-Cube mission and the Space Launch System, the Exploration EM1 mission from Argotec as well. Taking advantage of that kind of processing we did on board, actually, we're going to have the capability of processing on board the final target, checking the difference between the first pass and the second pass. What I mean, if a satellite is passing on the same point, and after 2 hours another satellite is going to pass on the same point, having the same illumination and everything, like similar to be compared, some data will be already processed on board. If there is a natural disaster or something, will be already giving a warning to the ground segment, to the ground people, the flight controller on board. This is going to be very much important for the future, because at the same time, if you have this capability, you're going to improve the algorithms, and it's going to be a very important infrastructure for the future. This means instead of launching new satellites, you're going to have those satellites having a long lifetime, at the same time the capability of refitting those satellites with the new software and new processing capabilities as well.
Absolutely. I mean, certainly as space becomes more accessible and interesting to companies from a business prospect, and Kirsten, to your point, launch is cheaper, so more people will have access and utilization. The sustainable aspect is critical, while also actually producing, right, and being efficient in what you're working on. But the data equation I find really interesting, because that is a very accessible entry point for a lot of companies and researchers to access data that hasn't been quantified, hasn't been qualified, but exist, for really creative ways for either better decision making or to enhance their back end processes. And so with the satellite proliferation equation, and as we start to see more constellations come up in low Earth orbit, I think that area is really interesting for entrepreneurs and new companies and existing companies to figure out how to pivot into space while accessing and utilizing space data. It's a really exciting one, where I think yields more questions than answers, but that's good, because it means that it's a green market. So we have a question from the chat that I would love to pull in, and this really ties at both of your expertise with the spacesuits and then also the human support systems. And the question is, how do we design life support systems with broader requirements about different biosystems in space?
I'll take a little initial stab at this, and then certainly look to David to see what other more expert opinions he may have. But I honestly, truly believe that we're kind of already there. NASA just has very strict requirements for like operating limits, but those systems will still work outside of those limits. But they have a different type of focus for what they're looking for on the International Space Station. When you open this up to industry, and they have other people that are wanting to come up there and maybe do some things that the governments would have frowned on, because that's just not maybe aligned with a strategic objective that they have. Those same systems will still operate. You just have to be able to look outside of that limit and say, yes, as a company, because of my objectives, I'm going to replace this filter more frequently, or I'm going to do this maintenance more frequently, because I'm willing to accept that based on the other things that I need to do in space. But certainly over to you, David, for other thoughts.
No, actually, I agree 100% because some of the systems are already in place since a long time, I can say, on the International Space Station. And I can say there are, most of the time, they are also refitting with new updates of those systems. So uh, even more, just an example, because there are some, just an example, the water is very, and the refilling the water from Earth is going to cost a fortune. So that's why, since as far as I remember, more than 8 years, they do have a system for producing the water or recycling the water. Somebody was, when we had the first espresso coffee made in space, somebody was saying, the pure yesterday actually became the coffee of tomorrow. uh, this is normal, because we have to see the station in general as a small planet where resources are very important, and we need to save the resources. And so the lifetime supports, most of the time, they are built in order to be compliant with the requirements of and the lack of resources.
Here's a slightly creative question coming from the chat as well, to follow on this theme of food in space. And, espresso keeps people very happy, but so does Italian food. And so they want to know, what are the complexities of getting pizza and pasta to space, because they'd love to eventually go to the commercial space station and have Italian food.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's cool.
yeah, this is a very much something that we also tried in the past. There is an important stuff. Example, we worked for the European astronaut on the bonus food. And before the astronauts went to the station, they had to decide which kind of food they wanted to have as a bonus. But actually, most of the time, they had to decide 18 months before their flight. Um, the main issue is that the shelf life of those products had to be at least has to be at least 1 year. And so the in order to preserve the food, you need to use completely different techniques, and the pizza is not going to be very good pizza, to tell you frankly. As Italian, they tried something, but actually, let me say, it was more a tacos than a pizza.
Yeah, I've definitely heard of the space tacos, and I imagine, because Italy has very strict standards on what qualifies as different pizza. I know there's the Napoli standard, right? You get the stamp of what's actually what qualifies as a Napoli's pizza. So I can imagine that it wouldn't be as good, but at least you could have something that replicates. Is there a reason why there was the 18-month lead time that they had to decide?
No, for the European astronauts, they had to decide 18 months because they went through a different tasting sessions. But the shelf life has to be at least 1 year, because due to the cargoes, the supply cargoes to the station.
And I'll just add here that for the Axiom astronauts who are also going to the International Space Station, they also do the food tasting, and it's also done through the same process, but we're able to shorten that a little bit. I think some of it just comes into play with the schedule that they have. But what I think is interesting about this is they do food tasting. They have NASA, when they provide the foods to the astronauts, they have a wide variety of different kinds of foods that can sort of fit different palates. Axiom Station, as we're flying, all these other new governments. We just flew the Saudi Arabian astronauts in May. We have 3 different national astronauts on AX3. Mm-hmm. Plan to have something different on AX4. We want to make sure that we're able to fly food that matches with each of the palettes. And so we're trying to look at different ways of making that more of a reality. We were approached about flying pizza on AX3, but yes, for a number of challenges, which were already sort of covered, that hasn't happened. But I think there's even other challenges that you don't think about. Your foods, you have to sort of assess them for different things. Like crumbly foods would be considered foreign object debris on the International Space Station. It can clog filters. So NASA typically does not like very crumbly foods. If it's a sauce, you have to figure out how it's going to adhere to the pasta, because you may have seen all the liquids, they bubble in space. And so how are you going to have maybe a sauce and a pasta? How do you combine those? How do you make it still similar to the types of foods that you ate on Earth? So yeah, just some other complexities to think about, because your food doesn't even behave the same way in orbit as you might have expected on Earth.
What's funny about your point about crumbly foods, I remember recently, within the past 5 years, I was at Kennedy Space Center and I was interacting with one of the displays that was talking about how astronauts eat in space, and they were talking about this crumble factor, right? And the how they have to select foods. And I thought back to astronaut ice cream that they always gave us as kids, and I'm like, I've been sold a myth. That is not what they eat.
You have.
Because you bite into it and immediately crumbles, and I'm like, oh, that's so sad.
But do you know that we have actually flown ice cream, like actual ice cream, to space? Because there are freezers that you can fly, like experiments and things like that, up and down. And so every so often, one of those freezers can be allocated to some delicious treat like gelato or ice cream or some other frozen, delicacy that they don't get. They don't get anything like that in orbit, because there's no way to transport it and then store it. And so you can just imagine how you might feel after 6 months. And you open that cargo hatch, you smell the coffee, the fresh fruit, and there's some ice cream. Like, how happy would that make you?
Wow. Yeah, because most of the time, the freezer, they're used for experiments, and they don't give room for ice cream or other stuff.
Every so often.
Yeah.
And maybe more on some of the Axiom flights. Maybe we can do a little bit more of that. I think that would be great for all involved.
Definitely.
I actually really love that you guys are thinking about this, because it is such a critical aspect. And I have two more questions from the chat that I kind of want to do lightning round, and then I have one final thought that I'd love to get from you. So the smaller one, the less complex one, is what are the impacts of space travel on taste and smell?
So actually you have sort of and I can say this, I was a biomedical engineer when I worked in the NASA Mission Control Center, so I worked with all the surgeons. You actually have a fluid shift to your head. And so you can imagine when you have a cold and you're very congested, it's similar to that. So you don't have the same palate. It's interesting, they do food tasting on Earth, but their palate is going to change in space. And so some of the foods that they liked on Earth are going to taste very different to them when they're in space, and maybe don't have as much flavor to them. Maybe it tastes a lot more bland. So it's the same thing. It's just like you have a cold for a long time.
Yeah, we had a survey with different astronauts just to go through the taste, and we had different opinions. There were some that, of course, it was feeling like a cold, having a less tasty food. Others, just an example, Paolo Nespoli told me, no, I never actually. He went through the survey done in a certain way. He told me finally the result was that he never saw a real change between Earth and the space station. So sometimes it's very personal, but most of the time, actually, Kirsten is really was right. Most of the time, the astronauts were saying that they had like a flu. The other stuff, most of the time, to avoid this, what you can do, putting more salt inside. But actually, this is going to be impossible, and maybe Kirsten can say even more why, just for the retention, the water retention.
Right. That's the other thing that the medical doctors are going to severely limit their salt intake and other things, just like they want to keep, and maybe you have more information too, David, but they have very strict requirements on the protein and all the other things too. So you have to balance all this out. And again, these are the types of things that we need to look at expanding a little bit, so that we're maybe a little bit less strict as we expand to more private individuals who are flying, and being able to allow a little bit more variety and, good taste.
Yeah, well, and this dovetails perfectly with one of the questions that the audience asked, because they were, inquiring about that gut brain axis and how, your brain is impacted in space, and really the nutritional considerations, right? And depletion of long-term impacts of living in space. And so if you could touch upon that briefly, it seems like you guys are studying that in terms of what to put into food, what not to put into food, how your body reacts. But do you have any comments on that in particular?
In particular, actually, let me say the brain, of course, is acting in a completely different way. Of course, we know everybody, and uh, also for the adaptation to space, because in the first days you have a syndrome of adaptation to space, and the vestibular system is working in a completely different way. And of course, the astronauts in the first 3 days of the mission, they are feeling really bad, I can say, and of course they are taking drug for avoiding the side effects. On the other side, for long-term missions, of course, this is gonna disappear after three days. For long-term missions, there are different possibility like osteoporosis and other problems to the bones and other problems but this is going to be happening for long-term missions. But in any case, of course, they are always controlled by the surgeries, by the physician on Earth, all the doctors on Earth. And there are of course several countermeasures for this.
Right. Yeah. Exercise is a big one of those. And so that's another thing where you were talking much earlier, David, about getting terrestrial companies involved in space and helping them understand the applications that could be for them. And I think exercise is one of those. Before I worked on console and mission control, I didn't understand how important exercise was to the astronauts. But when you are up there for 6 months, you have to exercise for about 2.5 hours a day in order to make sure that you have the strength and the ability to withstand reentry. So it's a very interesting thing. And these exercise devices have up to now been very custom designed. It's hard to maintain them. It hasn't really been made with space and the comfort of the astronauts in mind. It's just been sort of we have to do it. And so this is what it's going to be. But this is an area that will also need a bit of, that sort of comfort expansion.
Yeah, it's gonna require a lot more outfitting across the spectrum, and also collaboration, not just in the private sector, but also governments being able to help foster this sort of innovation that is then going to spin up into these commercial activities. And so for final thoughts, I'm curious if you could touch upon the roles of the private sector and the government in really building out this future, and in particular, if the space governance has adapted or will need to adapt to allow for these new space activities.
Yeah, I can say definitely there was a forced adaptation, and this is going to be even more in the future, real adaptation. We are changing completely the paradigm from the past, because in the past, I can say 90 or more, 100% of all the contracts they were coming from the government. But now the future is going to be completely changing. I can say we are roughly 80% from government and 20 from commercial activities and private activities. In the future, the shift is going to be shifting totally. So it's going to be maybe 20-30% from the government and the remaining from private sectors. What I can say that this is still very, very, very much important that the government will put their resources in the space research, in the space activities, because otherwise the single company will never be able to build amazing infrastructures for the private sector as well. So it's important the combination between the government and the private investments will come together, will work together also in the future. Because otherwise, just an example, the constellation of satellites we're going to deploy for the Earth observation in Italy will never be possible, or maybe the same SpaceX launchers will never be possible, or maybe the space station even would never be possible.
Right. I 100% agree. I look at how Axiom is operating today with our private missions to the International Space Station, and that is made possible through a proposal process that comes from NASA, so they have a contract award and things like that. But the revenue that we generate off of those missions is really from the astronauts and from the research. And so we're already making that transition. We have far more contracts in the private sector than we have in the government sector. I say that for the US government, but when we look at the fact that we're flying government astronauts, then it becomes a little bit more of a discussion about international governments are also supporting what we're doing. But I think we foresee that Axiom Station, once we have it up there, is a place where both the the private sector and public sector are working together. It isn't you have to go over here to do the government work and over here to do research and commercial work. It's all one thing. And being able to trade off, as you were saying, with the contracts, and sometimes in an economic environment, you need a little bit more commercial investment, and other times it's maybe a little bit more government, and you can do that together and sort of balance out the contracting depending on what's going on in the global environment.
Yeah, I think the constant examination of the push and pull and how those interact is going to look different as we evolve in terms of opportunity. And I can say that I am very excited about the future. You can sign me up for a future mission. I'll get my gut brain access all aligned. But thank you so much. This has been such a fun discussion, and I want to thank you for sharing your time and your expertise with us. So really appreciate it.
Thank you very much to you.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Absolutely. And for our audience, we sparked quite the discussion. So thank you for continuing to send in your questions. If we did not get to them, we will certainly jump into the chat and interact with you offline to make sure that we address all of your concerns and needs. And for our viewers as well, our next Spazio episode is October 19th, and we are going to be talking about Grottaglie, which is Italy's first spaceport. So please stay engaged, stay plugged in, and thank you for your interest in the future of space. There is a place for everyone. See you next time.